Hey everyone, before we start today's episode, I wanted to quickly tell you about the membership drive that I am doing on patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to celebrate over 2 years of this podcast. If we hit the goal of 100 new supporters at $5 or more a month or $50 a year, I'll be able to hire a producer, which would give me more time to focus on the research and interviews and actually start releasing 2 episodes a week instead of 1. If you become a supporter, in addition to getting early access to all episodes, you will also have access to our monthly hangout, in which myself and everyone else who supports this project come together and chat about pretty much everything. It happens every month on a Saturday, and you have access to the link and everything related to that on Patreon. And lastly, if you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing this podcast with your friends and families and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. This helps get more exposure to this podcast and introduce it to more folks. You can also follow this podcast and project on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack, and of course the main website. So thanks again everyone, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
My name is Nidal Betare. Currently, I am the managing director of People Demand Change, PDC, based in Washington, D.C. Originally, I am a Palestinian refugee from a Yarmouk camp in Damascus, Syria. I hold masters in political sociology. And when the war started, basically I was working with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent slash the Danish Red Cross, supporting Iraqi refugees in Syria, and also I was preparing to enroll in my PhD program that never happened, actually, because of the war.
So we're going to talk about a lot of things. We'll see how to organize them. I think it's just going to flow organically and naturally. So I didn't make the same kind of preparations I would have for other episodes that I'm not as, let's say, knowledgeable about, because a lot of the stuff I think we'll be talking about now are things that in one way or another I've talked in previous episodes with either Palestinians or Syrians or Lebanese, especially those three. And it's various tendencies and various problems that I think we will, or at least I've seen you express online that I definitely have had similar thoughts, basically. I guess one way, so let's just start this way. I read this recent thread of yours mentioning Samir Kassir. And Samir Kassir, for those who don't know, I will just quickly say, I did an episode 2 years ago, came out on June 2nd, 2020. Because it was 15 years since he had been assassinated. He was a Lebanese, Palestinian-Syrian intellectual who managed, unlike most people, I think, to manage to actually bring all three worlds together at the same time, and who saw no contradictions between the three at the same time. And that interview, I should say, was with Ziad Majid, who is a friend of his and a colleague and a comrade of Samir Kassir. Talk to us about that thread. What made you want to kind of write it on Samir Kassir? And I think because of the subject itself of the thread and what Samir Kassir presented, it will allow us to kind of get into the conversation deeper.
Right. Well, actually, it came during the elections in the most recent elections in Lebanon. I could not hide my happiness that some independents could break through this system in Lebanon. And for me, and maybe for so many people like my generation who were born in late 70s and grew up through the civil war in Lebanon, even though we were in Syria. But I mean, obviously, we were very, very engaged, especially like the Palestinian camps in Syria, the Palestinian refugee camps, I mean. And particularly maybe like these years between 2000 and 2005 when he was assassinated. Samir Kassir had a big impact on our generation, actually. And I think we owe him to him and to his friends and colleagues who founded the democratic left in movement in Lebanon, we owe him a lot of, if not a favor he did for political movements in the Arab world, specifically in Syria, maybe, but like opening our minds to understand more what's going on, the truth about the Syrian involvement in Lebanon, and how, to what extent it was embedded in the political system the Syrian political system, what extent it was embedded in the political system in Lebanon, and how the changes in Lebanon would lead to changes in Syria, basically because what's going on in Lebanon, a major factor of it is like the existence of the Syrian army and the Syrian intelligence and the Syrian political will that forced Lebanon to accept so many incidents and agreements or accords through the history, and obviously led between 1975 and 1989 to a civil war in Lebanon that we cannot, whatever we do, we cannot drop off the Syrian factor from it. Samir Kassir could articulate the narrative of the history of this period in a way that opened our minds to a lot of blind spots that we could not see it. It's very important, Joey, to know that Syria did not have open media or satellite and internet until the beginning of 2000s. Before that, it was limited to certain class in Syria. It was not available for everyone. So basically, we're living in a very, very, very close society. And basically, we're living in our neighborhoods and closed in our neighborhoods. And we know what we are told in our neighborhoods. Add to that there is a huge machine of supervision and monitoring for all publications in Syria, including النهار, where Samir Kassir was used to write. So one of the jokes, which is like not a joke, it's a reality. Like when النهار used to come to Syria sometimes, because they let some of النهار publications to come to Syria, the Syrian government used to rip off the pages that they did not like what happened with other newspapers and media outlets at that time. But with the open with the internet and the satellite that started to enter Syria and every house in Syria, I would say maybe 2002, 2003, and after that, it helped people to know more. And for us in the University of Damascus specifically, Samir Kassir was always there. I mean, we used to talk a lot about his articles, about his opinion, and actually he could, to an extent, to start a movement within a younger generation of the Syrian opposition about the reality of the existence of the Syrian army in Lebanon. This is when we started to call it the occupation. Before that, it was the Syrian army helping Lebanon to stabilize and like after the civil war, but it lasted forever actually. So I think our generation, to an extent, we owe him a lot. And one of the the things, I mean, like Samir Kassir, his legacy did not die when he was assassinated, to be honest with you. His legacy actually was revealed really after he died. And Samir Kassir Foundation did amazing job in helping the Syrian activists who left and fled Syria, and I was one of them.
Thanks for that. No, I mean, Asir's, and listeners who don't know will I think understand why we started this conversation with him. He's still very relevant. I wrote this article with a Syrian friend in 2019, which was published in الجمهورية, and it was in the context of the uprising in Lebanon at the time. So we published it, I think, in November 2019. And the image and it was about Syrian melancholy in the Lebanese revolution was the title, i.e. that a lot of Syrians that I was speaking to and recognized some of the chants, obviously, because a lot of those chants were first chanted in Syria. The Yalla Ehal Ya Bashar, it was just changed into Yaon, for example, or whatever, or any of the other chants as well. And the image that I use in that article is a mural that a person calls himself Syrian Banksy did in Idlib, and it's a quote in one of Samir Kassir's last articles before he was killed. When the Arab Spring blooms in Beirut, it announces the time of roses in Damascus. And this is in 2005, before what we then referred to as the Rubia al-Arabi, like the Arab Spring. And there was very much this sense that, as I said, he was one of the few people who did not see a contradiction between calling for freedom in Syria and fighting against sectarianism in Lebanon, calling for freedom in Palestine, etc., etc. He very much saw these infrastructures of oppression, as we might call them, as in many ways interlinked in one way or another. And to this day, you mentioned the New Democratic Left, and I think to this day we have some good indications of something going in that direction, and hopefully it continues that way. We'll see. But there hasn't really been something like it since, largely because it was killed off. Obviously, him and George Howie both assassinated, and his other colleagues either forced into exile or at least some kind of de facto self-censorship for protection and so on. I was with, I won't say who, but I was with one of the colleagues, and we were sitting at comrades. We were sitting at one of the hotels that the New Democratic Left they isolated themselves there after, I forgot who was killed first. I think it was George Howie who was killed first, or Samir
Kassir, and
it was like a 3 weeks period.
Samir Kassir first, I think in February 2005, and then 2 weeks later...
Samir was in June 2005.
In June, and then 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks later, George Howie. Yeah.
So in that period of 2 weeks, that members of that group were basically hiding in that hotel. They didn't leave there. And then George Howie obviously left at some point, and he was assassinated that day. And after that, a lot of the same people in that circle either went into exile or went into hiding in one way or another, and so on. It's very important to kind of talk about this period between 2000 and 2005. In 2005, I'll quickly say for those who don't know, I did a number of episodes on this, but in 2005, February 14, 2005, which is Valentine's Day, so it's easy to remember, Hariri was assassinated, the prime minister, and this followed a pretty massive, to this day not really rivaled, with the exception of maybe the October uprising in 2019 to some extent, pretty massive uprising, which was later called the Cedar Revolution, calling for the expulsion of the Syrian regime and soldiers. And it was a cross-section of society. This was before the March 14 coalition became a thing, and then it became sectarianized. This was the initial few months, essentially, of when essentially anyone who was opposed to the regime's presence in Lebanon went to the streets, and they came from all walks of life. George Howie, as we mentioned, was the communist, Samir Kassir, communist and then socialist, others kind of on the left, and then you'll have people who are on the center and some people on the right, and conservatives and liberals and what have you. There was just this one goal, essentially, nothing as to what follows, with the exception of people like the New Democratic Left, which had at least a vision of Lebanon, which was a secular vision, basically I guess you would call it like a social democratic vision of Lebanon, something along those lines.
Movement.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So this is why it's so important, because so much happened after 2005. Obviously, the assassinations, and then the war in 2006, and then another smaller war in 2008, and then obviously everything that's followed. It's actually very difficult to stop and take stock of just the changes that even were happening in those few years. And it's also in those few years, if I have my timeline right, that there was also obviously exchanges between like Lebanese intellectuals and writers and Syrians and Palestinians in both Lebanon and Syria, to some extent in Palestine as well, although obviously you have the security aspect there that will make it more difficult, but there was that as well. And I later found out, I didn't actually know this when I was still kind of like more Lebanon focused, but I later found out that there was more of an organic link between Lebanese intellectuals and Syrians and Palestinians in Syria intellectuals. And they were very much speaking to one another, and they were calling to each other's future springs, if you want to use those terms. And this was still in the early 2000s. There was still kind of the hope that many had that like Bashar would be more moderate than his father. Obviously, we were very wrong about that. But there was still that window. There was a window that people felt like more could be done there.
Right.
Talk to us a bit about that, if that's okay. Like, what do you remember from that, or what can you tell us about that?
Right. Yeah. So, but every time we talk about this movement that started after the death of Hafez al-Assad, and then when Bashar al-Assad inherited in 5 minutes the power in Syria, I like to say something and to remind people of something. What happened between 2000 and 2005, and maybe like 2011 until the revolution started? It was not something that erupted from nothing. The Syrians never stopped challenging this regime, ever. Since Hafez al-Assad came to power, or al-Ba'ath party came to power in 1963, and there were, like, let me just say this, maybe people won't like it, but I think from like the perspective of history, this is when the Arab nationalism was peaking up, and there were like Hafez al-Assad and a lot of people around him. They were very young and like in their 30s and believed in the Arab nationalism, etc. But Hafez al-Assad actually had another vision other than what Michel Afdaq, Salahuddin Bitar, and all these founders of the Arab nationalism movement around the Arab world, actually. And he could oppress and get rid of so many of his friends until between 1963 and 1975, when he really started to control Syria by himself. Before that, he was not. After that, these movements that the Syrians did not stop the movements of resistance. So you see like a lot of communists and Hizb Rabatat al-Amal al-Shuyu'i, for example, the Communist Labor League, I think this is what it's called, and they were oppressed, imprisoned for tens of years. I mean, I know people who just like spent half of their lives in the prisons of Hafez al-Assad. So this did not stop and when Bashar al-Assad came to power, there were the seeds to start something new, and there was a new generation. And it was like actually what happened after Bashar al-Assad came to power, it was kind of generational. So there is the older generation, and I'm not gonna say any names in this episode, because for me, I freak out now about telling names, honestly, because some of them are in Syria or in Lebanon or in the region, and like everyone is reachable these days. So a lot of like for the older generation, they thought that Bashar al-Assad will bring some reforms because of the speech he gave, like the open speech of his presidency. And he promised the open society, open economy, providing like internet and open media, blah, blah, all these things. But for our generation, I still remember, because I was studying sociology in Damascus University that time, there was a wave of people who did not believe that Syria will be controlled by Bashar al-Assad, who inherited the power in 5 minutes by changing the constitution in the Syrian parliament. So there is a young generation that completely rejected Bashar al-Assad.
So just to explain, he changed the constitution because
he was 34.
He was too young, so they had to change the constitution.
Yeah. So I think the Syrian constitution before that, it was 40 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to fact check this, because that was when Hafez al-Assad came to power. He was 40 years old. And when Bashar came to power, he was 34. So they changed the constitution in 3-4 minutes in the parliament, which was ridiculous and humiliating and insulting to all Syrians and to the law in general. So people did not, there was rejection. And I would say this rejection was translated in starting a wave or a movement among students in the universities in Syria, across Syria. Actually, it was not only Damascus University, but Damascus was a hub at the time for this movement. That, in my opinion, this wave encouraged the older generation to do something. And then they started doing the Rabيع Dimashq, Damascus Springs, and the 99 intellectuals who signed that letter to Bashar al-Assad. I think it started 2000 or 2001, and then Lijan Ihya al-Mujtama al-Madani. That happened when, as you mentioned, really there was a communication, not only between like the Syrian opposition and the Lebanese who opposed the Syrian regime. Oh, no, also there was another generation in Lebanon growing up, and they grew up under the brutality of the Syrian occupation, and they suffered. There are quite a lot of story of how the Syrians oppressed the Lebanese and controlled the political movements in Lebanon and the civil society, and they tried to control the civil society in Lebanon. So this communication was open. And my generation, like, I remember when I was maybe 2002, 2003, this is when we started having meetings or exchange visits with some friends in Lebanon who later became part of the democratic left movement. And I focus a lot on this movement because, in my opinion, it was one of the first independent movements in the region that had a vision, political vision, and had a strategy to change. And it did not see that the change in Lebanon would come from Lebanon itself, but also it would come from neighboring countries like Syria, for example. And it makes sense. And this is why I believe that what Samir Kassir brought, the democracy of Syria and the independence of Lebanon, is very, very accurate statement, and it has underneath a lot of theory about the relations between the two countries, the two societies, and the two political systems in these two countries. And this was proved actually in 2005 and later on after 2011 when the Syrian revolution started. And maybe we can talk more about it later.
Absolutely. So as we mentioned, you just
There's something I missed.
yeah.
There's something I missed, Joy, because this is very important. In 2005, after the assassination of Samir Kassir and the assassination of George Howie, there was a huge campaign of arrests in Syria, by the way. I have 30 friends that I used to hang out with, who all of them were arrested in 2005, 2006. And there was a list of 150 students in the university that were supposed to be arrested. And they were not arrested because these 30 people who were in prison, they did not tell on their friends. But these people were imprisoned for 5 years and 6 years, and they were not. They were only released between, I think, April 2011, after the eruption of the Syrian revolution, between the April 2011 and the end of 2011. So even and these were, remember, these were young in the university, in the second year or third year in their college, and then Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian security just cut their lives and put them in prison and basically destroy their future. And bear in mind that these people, they were only talking about the freedom of expression, about changes, reforms in the Syrian political system, open the opportunity for people to express their opinions and to form whatever forums and political parties they want to establish or form. But Bashar al-Assad and people around him, they just continued the mentality that Hafez al-Assad and al-Ba'ath party established in Syria in 1970, that al-Ba'ath party is the only party and the leading party in the Syrian revolution. And this was the biggest statement that proved to be a lie and a way to turn into a dictatorship and later on to massacre the Syrian people. So this generation and these people, I still remember these conversations that we used to have, Joey, like those years in between 2006 2007, basically, because it lasted for a while. It was full of ambitions and full of energy to make a change, and a peaceful change in Syria. But as we discovered later, like, this regime was built in a way that there is no way to reform it whatsoever. The only way to reform this system is just to get rid of it, honestly.
No, I obviously completely agree with that. I was thinking before that when I said that there hasn't been something like the New Democratic Left movement, it's not entirely true. There hasn't been a explicitly political movement that was trying to run for elections and that sort of thing. But there's been like legacies that we saw. For example, two things that come to mind is when I was at AUB, American University of Beirut, I was doing my undergrad there. You had the secular club. And the secular club was very explicitly pro-Palestine and at the same time very explicitly anti-Assad. And very explicitly, obviously, as the name suggests, anti-sectarianism in Lebanon and so on. And so they were making these links very early on, very much echoing Samir Kassir and often bringing him up as well. And the other thing is, more recently, and this happened after 2015, you have like media outlets like Megaphone is a big one now. It wasn't that big in 2015 when it just started and they were struggling with different finances, whatever. But they are also one of the few that I can think of media outlets that are so explicitly anti-authoritarian on everything, on all fronts, whether even if they are bringing up Ukraine and Russia, they will be anti-Putin. Even they will support the solidarity, they will be in solidarity with protesters in Iran and Iraq and Lebanon and pro-Syrian revolution, pro-Palestine, on all fronts, anti-Saudi Arabia, what have you. All of the different layers of anti-authoritarianism is something that they definitely hold to heart. And I do think that this is one of the many legacies of someone like Kassir, basically.
100%. 100%. And we can see that, Joey, if we take a quick look at the global left these days, right? And the way they were divided on topics like Syria, on topics like Ukraine, and the increasing number of all these propaganda media outlets that they are trying to twist the narrative and this circular reasoning, like conspiracy theory, whatever. So you are absolutely right, and honestly, maybe you want to talk about this later, but I think this is a good point now to bring this up. Like, for me as a Syrian Palestinian, this is where I am really squeezed, right? I mean, and it has so many levels, Joey. Like, there is the emotional level of it, especially when you see intellectuals in Ramallah and West Bank and Gaza who are pro Bashar al-Assad. And it is hard for me to accept that. And it's hard for me to believe that they are still pro-Assad, even though they experienced, a lot of them, they experienced firsthand the Syrian regime, because so many Palestinians who live in Ramallah today, they lived in Damascus before that, before Oslo. This is one. And secondly, look what happened to the Palestinians in Syria. I mean, Yarmouk camp, I think, one case study for the left who really should be focusing on to expose the hypocrisy of a regime and this and political system like Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad built their legacy over 4 years, for more than 40 years. I wrote this once, and I would say it now. Hafez al-Assad, when, like, in the 1980s, he split the Palestinian factions, Fatah, basically, and demonstrations erupted in Damascus and or in Yarmouk camp, and people started like chanting "Asadun, Asadun fi Lebanon, Fa'run, Fa'run fi Jawlan," and he literally asked
Try and translate that, Nidal.
military, a lion in Lebanon, a mouse in Golan Heights. So you go and you express your power in Lebanon, but your front lines in Golan Heights are shut up. This is basically what people were saying. And
it's a play on word on
wanted to
it's a play on word on the name himself, Assad, which means lion, of course.
Assad, exactly. So he wanted to destroy Yarmouk camp at that time, but there were some powerful Palestinians at that time, and it was the end, like basically at the end of the era of having Palestinian in power in Syria at that time, who prevented Hafez al-Assad from doing that, and it challenged him, and they threatened him of going to a war with the military if he does that. And he did not do. Bashar al-Assad, he used the Russian fighter jets to burn this camp to the ground. He starved these people for years to death. More than 200 people starved to death in the Yarmouk camp. I mean, I cannot imagine that these stories that people watched it live streamed on media and TVs, that my people, the Palestinian people in Gaza or in Ramallah, would think that this is pro-Palestine. It's just like surreal for me, and I cannot get my head around it, to be honest with you. So, and unfortunately, this part of Palestinians is so supported by the left around the world. And the left around the world, they really have a huge support to the Palestinian cause. And because of this narrative that Palestinians in Palestine narrated and supported that they are pro-Bashar al-Assad, and Bashar al-Assad is the solo power in the Arab world, or maybe around the world, that he is anti-colonialism and capitalism and imperialism, that he's a good guy. Even though a few weeks ago, a horrible, terrifying video for a Tadaman massacre was released, and basically I cannot find any difference between what happened in Sabra and Shatila and what happened in Tadaman, honestly. People don't like this narrative, but isn't it true?
Yeah.
Isn't it killing is killing?
Absolutely. I am Lebanese Palestinian. I'm part Palestinian as well. And I come from a family that in 1982, my father was in the Red Cross in Lebanon, and he witnessed the Sabra and Shatila massacre. He was there during it, as the Red Cross was allowed in at some point. And just a few years later, end of the 80s, our home, the one I'm recording from right now, was bombed by the Assad regime. And so those links
Right.
have never been very like, my family is not particularly political, but because of this heritage, I also didn't really see much of a contradiction between opposing the Syrian regime in 2005 during the Syria revolution. I was there. I was 14 years old, and there was a bunch of people who went with schools, and it was a pretty massive thing. I really cannot describe it. It's one of the early memories. And I saw no contradiction between this and then supporting the revolution in 2011 and then 2019 here, and obviously supporting the Palestinian struggle in Palestine as well. There was never much of a contradiction, and yet because of those meta-narratives and the narratives and how they end up being very decontextualized, especially with the internet, or at least we're seeing it more with the internet probably. A lot of people just don't bother knowing these details. It doesn't. I've been in many situations where I had to explain to people, for example, that I am anti-Zionist because I'm anti-Assad, and therefore they assume that because of that I have some kind of soft spot for Israel or whatever, as if like the nuances is almost too complicated for a lot of people, because they want very simplistic black and white, just this and that, and that's it. And you have big narratives, and obviously they don't only erase Yarmouk, they erase Jolan, as you mentioned. They don't speak to people who are Syrians in occupied Jolan, who obviously know that the Syrian regime is not going to liberate it anytime soon. They have all of those things that, if one is following the Syrian revolution especially, they're very obvious, they're very straightforward, they don't surprise you, they shock, but they don't surprise necessarily. But if you don't follow the specifics, and that's why I should say, Syria has kind of become like a litmus test for me, with many people that I know. But if they tell me they're pro-Palestine, I'm like, okay, that's good, okay, I understand, but I still have to wait a bit. I have to wait a bit and see what do they think about Syria, if at all. Some people don't know. It's okay. There is ignorance. They can learn. But you have other people who immediately will have all of those narratives and discourses that they have taken from somewhere. And that's where all of the red flags for me kind of, are raised. And many times, this has happened many times. While I was living in the UK, in Lebanon proper, it's something that, with almost zero exceptions almost, it has never failed, this litmus test, because it says a lot about the priority of the person, whether they support a cause for the aesthetics or whether they support a principle on a broader anti-authoritarian principle, essentially.
Right, Joey. And actually, it's a position and a place that would keep you all the time arguing, because I would say that I am not a social media guy, you know. I don't have Facebook. I don't have Instagram. I tried it. I didn't like it. But something happened in 2014 or 15, I think, that one of my friends sent me a message that a media outlet here in the United States took an article I wrote for, or a report actually. It was very long, like 15 pages, report on Yarmouk camp to the Institute of Palestine Studies, IPS, and they twisted it and they put it on Twitter. So I created my Twitter account, and I was new here in the United States, so I didn't know that much about the Arab communities, or like how they perceive our life there, Palestine, Syria. I was quite new here. I came here to 2013, so I was still learning, and I am still learning, obviously. So that was the shock when this institution that we used, and maybe that was the only media outlet that the Syrian government let us in Syria read since 2000, and it is based here in the United States, and it's a Palestinian website and founded by very respectful academics who later on left, talked about Al Yarmouk camp as if the Syrian opposition destroyed it, and they said, like, just to make it kind of a cool title, that they share blame. So this is when I started to understand that, okay, let's go back to social media. So I created not this Twitter account, and another one, like an older one, and I started reading and understand how Palestine is very essential for the left, and how Syria somehow turned into a place that Bashar al-Assad is fighting to get rid of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which is hilarious, which is a huge uh, um, misconception to the narrative of the Syrian, not only the Syrian revolution, Joe, to the history of the struggle of the Syrian people against al-Ba'ath party, against Hafiz al-Assad, against Bashar al-Assad. So this is where I found myself, okay, so I am Palestinian, obviously, and I am Syrian, and I am squeezed in this place that I have to explain to people, especially in the left, and especially to my Palestinian brothers, that, wait a minute, this is not true, this is not what happened, this is not the narrative. But I have to say, Joey, that it is not only like the whole Syria, the narrative of the Syrian revolution is to be told yet, to be honest with you. I think because of the amount of displacement, the amount of massacres, the amount of killing, people did not have the chance to breathe yet, to think, and to tell their stories. But it's coming, it's gonna come, and what happened in Syria is gonna be told, I think, very soon. And I think we partially we are responsible to tell the Syrian what happened in Syria, and in platforms like yours, for example, right? So I understand what you're saying, and I'll tell this, and then you can, tell you this story, and then you can take it from there. Like, I was in a funeral the other day, like 3 days ago, and it was the first time that I go to a place here in the United States, to a place where it's full of Arab community and mainly Palestinians. From West Bank, from Na'lin, Bal'in, and all the wall area. For them, I was Syrian, and it hurt me that my identity is not that important for people. I cannot blame them. I mean, there are like people who were raised in Palestine. Maybe they don't know that much. They don't read that much. They don't watch news that much. But they shocked me to an extent that some of them, they thought that the Yarmouk camp is in Lebanon, for example. You know, um, and we in Syria, why? I mean, one of the things that I heard, why did you do that in Syria? You were living good life. Who told you that Syrians were living good life? People compare the situation of Palestinian refugees with Lebanon, with Gaza, with the refugee camps like Jenin in the West Bank. And then they come up with this conclusion that the life of the Palestinian refugees in Syria was good. Oh no, it was not good for Palestinians, it was not good for Syrians, and there is a huge history of struggle for Palestinians in Syria with the Syrian government, with the Syrian regime, and for Syrians in Syria with the Syrian regime since 1963. And what happened in 2011 is just the eruption of all this struggle that has been accumulating for decades. I'm sorry, maybe I talked a lot.
Not at all, not at all. I was just thinking, this is not the first time I hear a Syrian Palestinian person I know from Yarmouk specifically saying that when they've spoken with other Palestinians, usually in the diaspora, because obviously the context is this is the only place you can do it really in practice. Kind of not knowing the specificity of the Yarmouk experience or the specificity of the Syrian experience more broadly. This happened. I remember this conversation. I think I brought it up in the previous episode. I was sitting with a friend from Yarmouk and a friend from Gaza, as it happens. So there was like the Palestinian-Syrian, and the Palestinian-Lebanese, myself, kind of speaking to one another. And the Palestinian from Gaza, very anti-Assad and everything, genuinely did not know that there were so many other Palestinians who were not anti-Assad. He just assumed, he grew up in Gaza, he was born and raised there. He just assumed that everyone was. And there was this very interesting dynamic where I got to see kind of the friend from Yarmouk's perspective, in that sense, and the frustration being built up, especially by then he was already part of the diaspora because he had to leave Syria as well, obviously. Seeing this kind of alienation from a lot of those movements that, on the one hand, were using the language of, anti-oppression, anti-colonialism, etc., while on the other hand, not really even paying attention, not just when Syrians were killed, but including when Palestinian Syrians are killed in Syria. And this, you brought it up before, so obviously let's talk about it now. The Tadaman massacre, the video came out a few weeks ago, and there was a bunch of reports and whatnot, and the video is still something that's in my mind. I haven't been able to get rid of it. And so I will read this short text that I wrote on this for those who don't know. And then we can kind of talk about it. So recently, brutal footage of the Tadaman massacre surfaced, which showed Syrian intelligence officers massacring civilians in the Damascus neighborhood of Tadaman. And the irony is Tadaman means solidarity, just for people who don't speak Arabic. One story, which was retold by a Lebanese friend of mine, Karim Shaib, for Al Jazeera, is that of Wasim Siyam, a 42-year-old Palestinian-Syrian who was forcibly disappeared by the Assad regime in 2013. His family did not know that he was executed just 2 days after being taken, because they only found out because they saw him in that video, essentially. And there are many names that have surfaced since then of people who were in the Palestinian Syrians who were massacred. I'll read some of the names I have here. I believe you tweeted them as well. Nidal Saadani, Hamoud al-Zammar, Iyad al-Khatib, Muhammad Aymari, where's the name? Sorry, Ahmad Saleh, Tariq Naji, Ahmed Yunus, Muhammad Zaidan, and Muhammad Shahoudi. I guess I'll just ask you, talk to us a bit about it, your reaction to seeing the footage, and your reaction to, just talk about it first, and then I have a follow-up question that I'll ask after.
Right. Well, this massacre is a known one, and the video is old. It's not new, but for some reason, for many reasons, like related to things, maybe it's not the right time to talk about it now. It was not revealed before, but this is one of more than 5 or 6 other massacres that took place there, and this one maybe is, if we're gonna talk about like the size of the massacre, this is the small one. There are massacres that killed thousands. More than 1,500 people were killed in one massacre. It's called the Kablat massacre, and I think some people are working on a report about this massacre or something about it. What would I say? What I say, Joey? I mean, seeing this video was very traumatizing. I'll be very frank and very, very, very honest with you here. Last time I was in Syria, it was in April 2012 in Al-Qusayr area in Homs, when Hezbollah and the Syrian regime were trying to take over Al-Qusayr area. The amount of death and bodies that I saw thrown in the streets made me decide to not go back to Syria again. I could not handle it, and maybe I was afraid. Honestly, I mean, sometimes I don't believe that I'm still alive until now, because it was terrible. Like, and I tried to get rid of all these pictures from my mind, and I couldn't. And then when the Massacre of Tadaman was released, the video was released, I hesitated a lot before I watched it, and I couldn't watch the 6 minutes. I only watched like the first 2 or 3 minutes because it's unbelievable. And the issue, Joey, there's nothing good about a massacre, right? And there is nothing good about seeing people getting killed. But I think Syrians and Palestinians in Syria, they exhausted all the tools and the means to explain to the world how awful the situation in Syria was. It is a situation that is beyond imagination. People do not have, I mean, normal people in West or anywhere stable in this world, and even for us, before the war, the human brain is not capable of imagining this level of brutality. So it is good that it's released. It is good that it's released because, and it was released in good timing because of what's happening in Ukraine, especially after Bucha, and the international solidarity with the victims of Bucha. However, such videos, I mean, I encourage everyone who has videos like this, and I know that a lot of people, they really have, and they still keep it until now without revealing it. I encourage all the organizations who work on social and on justice in Syria, specifically these organizations, to start a campaign and to start releasing the documents they have, videos, footage, whatever they have to the public. Because it is part of the Syrian story, and it is an essential part of the brutality of the Syrian of al-Assad regime, that there is no way anyone could imagine it or understand it unless they see it. And yet you'll see people that they will say otherwise about it. It was horrible, Joey, and this brought me, like, also it was released in a few maybe weeks or days before the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, right? I think it was the same, and it was ironic to see also how divided we are as Syrians and Palestinians. Honestly, it was heartbreaking, because I know a lot of Syrians who work on social on bringing Assad to justice. Like, they have organizations, or they are writers, intellectuals. They have good platforms, and they have a strong voice, that they were silent about the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. And also, I know a lot of Palestinians who did not believe that what happened in Tadaman was real. And it's such an irony that I have no words to explain it, Joey. I can explain it in an academic way, that I understand, because this was basically my master's degree, that Palestinian people, they live under political, social, and economic structures that are different from each other. Our life in Syria is different than Lebanon, is different than Jordan, different than Gaza, different than West Bank, but we all have a cause. I am still a Palestinian refugee. I was born like this. My father was like this, and I am still like this. And if I did not come to the United States, my daughter will be also a Palestinian refugee, So we will live refugees all our lives. My grandfather, my grandparents, all of them died refugees in the refugee camp. And the refugee camp has a legacy and a backbone legacy in the Palestinian in the Palestine cause, that I think Palestinian intellectuals and academics should recognize it. On the other hand, I will close with you about this topic with this. PLO and the Palestinian factions, all of them, are responsible for twisting the narrative of what happened in Syria, not only with the Palestinians in Syria, what happened in Syria in general. Because Sultan Ramallah, the authority in Ramallah, turned into a company for hire for the Arab dictators in the region, not only for Bashar al-Assad. I know that they helped Bashar al-Assad big time, and they are responsible for this, and they are responsible for the narrative that they are telling people in West Bank and Gaza. Honestly, they carry this responsibility forever, and they are a burden on us now. They don't represent us.
I completely agree. It has been heartening to see whenever we have had protests last year, and obviously after Shireen's murder as well, calls for the overthrow of the PA as well, because I do think it's important. On the Tadaman massacre, and honestly not just that, but for me there's always, I kind of categorize reactions that I see in like different groups. You'll have people who deny, that's like one category. You'll have people who are shocked and horrified, that's another category. And you have people who are silent. And the silence is often the majority. Most people that I know in any case, and specifically most Palestinians I know in the diaspora with a large platform, which is always more important for just reality reasons, that because they have a large platform, more people are seeing what they do, whatever. Haven't said anything on Tadaman. And I know that they know about it because I know some of them, or I know their acquaintances. We have mutuals, and some of those mutuals, for that matter, are Syrian Palestinians. And so I know that they would have known about it by now, but they haven't said anything about it. And I think it sort of reinforces the idea that what matters isn't who is being killed, but what matters is who is doing the killing. And this kind of reverses what should be the case as activists, as protesters, as anti-authoritarian, what have you. If you're fighting for something better, you're fighting on a set of principles. And those principles have to be applied regardless of who is doing the oppression. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I had to explain to people that Hezbollah is not a left-wing party. I don't know how many times I had to explain this, that it is quite literally maybe the most conservative party in Lebanon right now. One of the main parties, and in many ways the main party that has upheld this regime, the main party that wanted Hariri to stay in power after the uprising in 2019, asked for him to resign. The main party that has, I think the only party at this point that doesn't have a single woman representative in their entire movement, and so many other things. Nasrallah calling LGBTQ rights an imposition from the West, the Western import, demonizing feminists, on all categories of what counts as a conservative or even a far-right ideology. They tick a lot of the boxes. And yet at the same time, because of history, because of course they were part of the resistance against Israel, many people forget that they were not actually the main ones. And arguably in the 80s they made it worse because they focused a lot of their attention on actually assassinating communists who were also resisting Israel. So there's all of those different nuances that it's like and I say this specifically in the context of Lebanon because it's where I grew up and it's my main point of reference. Even among independents, I mean, I was very happy also to see major Assadist figures being voted out, Firzli and Arslan and some of the others as well. It was very, very, very funny, to be honest, but it was very good to see. But I still think that there is a Syria question, if you want to put it that way, just as there is a Palestine question, which Samir Kassir obviously identified early on and said that you can't think of freedom in one place without also thinking of the freedom in another place. And I think that even within my circles of independents, mostly leftists, progressive activists, and so on, there is still a difficulty in talking about Syria. And that difficulty comes in many ways. Sometimes it's trauma because of the Assad regime in Lebanon. Sometimes it's, politicking priorities, whatever. But other times it's like it's a block. It's an ideological block. And it's why you have people who are still, they're not pro-Hezbollah, but you feel like they treat Hezbollah in a different category than they would the Lebanese forces or the Kataib or the others. And that, essentially, it's a blind spot, I think, is only possible by not fully engaging with the question of Syria. Because, as you mentioned now, and as soon as I speak to Syrians who have had some interaction with Hezbollah, it's very clear, it's very straightforward what Hezbollah's role has been in Syria. There's very little doubt. They say so themselves, obviously, but Syrians would say even more. I've met many, many Syrians from Yarmouk, for that matter, from elsewhere, in Homs, especially in Qusayr, as you mentioned, who have either had their house destroyed by Hezbollah or occupied by Hezbollah or have been looted by Hezbollah or what have you. And yet, a lot of the people I know, and here I'm saying like very well-meaning Lebanese activists who are by no means pro-Assad, all of them would say that the regime is a bad regime and so on. but it's almost like they stop at the border. Like the Assad regime, okay, they were bad in Lebanon, but they left in 2005, and it's no longer the same kind of priority or what have you. And I think this is it is a major problem in Lebanon.
Right. Well, I would say maybe Joey, maybe it's temporary. Because the situation today in Lebanon, I don't know, like people would say sometimes that the situation during the civil war in Lebanon was better than the situation today, right? Especially like, it's like, basically this is like if like the state failed basically, and the institutions in the country are just gone. So I would point two things here, like this thing that I'm talking about, that it is temporary, and people are just exhausted now of thinking about day-to-day life. Everyone in Lebanon now, like from like the lower middle class, middle upper middle class, and in between, and lower than that and upper than that. I don't remember in my lifetime that Lebanon was in such a situation like this, before, honestly. So there is a collapse in the country, a real collapse, physical collapse that happened with the blast, and there is a economic collapse that's we are living now, and there is the social collapse that is represented by this current political class that Hezbollah is one of it. And this is why you feel that it's good that there are independents, that there are, and that they voted out some people like firstly who are pro Assad. However, this differentiation or this cut off or about talking in Lebanon about Syria, I think it's just temporary because of the current situation, and because Lebanon is going through a huge change that it's gonna last for like 4 more years. I think like maybe a decade or more, to get rid of all this political class that ruined the country and ruined neighboring countries as well, like Syria, and like what Hezbollah did in Syria. And because the interaction between Lebanon and Syria is very difficult to diffuse in many on many levels. I will give you this example. When Hezbollah entered Syria, Joey, back in 2000, the end of 2011, the beginning of 2012. If you remember, they entered from villages that they called it the Shiite Lebanese villages in Syria, and it was population of Syrian people from like villages like Zaydiya, Yarmouk on the borders with Hermel, that they are divided on between like on the two sides of the border. So this is how they interacted, and they justified their intervention in Syria, and then later on they said, "Oh, we are protecting the holy places in Syria," and go on. And this intervention showed how the political systems in both countries would reflect and interact and work with each other and reflect each other sometimes on so many levels that you cannot imagine sometimes, and like until you live it. And this is when we were talking earlier, when we were emailing earlier, and you told me we were emailing about this piece, that how the conventional system in Lebanon impacted and had a huge impact on the Syrian revolution. When I said that Durzi went to Durzi, to Kamal Jumblat, Sunni went to Saad al-Hariri, and the Christians went to either to Samir Kassir, basically, more than anyone else. And this is like, to this extent, the socio-political culture in both countries is interacted to this extent. And I think that it negatively impacted both Lebanon and Syria. We cannot deny, this is one of the levels on the show, that what happened in Syria impacted Lebanon, and what's going on today and what's going on in Lebanon today is impacting Syria big time. And I think we will see a lot of consequences that we will hear about that we've never heard or imagined in the near future, especially about the economic and the money laundering of Bashar al-Assad in Lebanon and vice versa. So there is fundamental relationships that it's hard, but Lebanon today is a place that miserable. I mean, like, people are leaving. People, like young people, youth, like, they don't have future anymore. They're just like, look at them. They are in Erbil, in Erbil, Iraq, or in Istanbul in Turkey, or in some other cities in Turkey, or they are trying to go to Europe. I mean, it's heartbreaking, but it's understandable, I think, Joey. I don't want to undermine the fact that that Syria should be present all the time, but it's understandable if people take a break maybe and focus on, okay, what are we going to eat today, right? What happened with the court about the blast? Is there a trial or not? Is there someone like this, someone like who's going to be put in court or brought to justice or not? I mean, these are big questions that, like, Lebanese are like really focusing on now, and I understand and I respect that, and it's priority. It's really priority. What happened in Lebanon, the blast was hilarious. I mean, who could imagine that? And we will see, and I bet you, and mark my words, if the truth was revealed one day, it's going to be connected to the Syrian government 100%. I have zero doubt about it.
Me too. And that's obviously that's the big question in Lebanon always, because at the start of every new regime, it's become almost a tradition in Lebanon. They start with amnesty laws and they forgive their own crimes, and there's always the risk that they do this with everything, just as they did with the crimes against the Mafqudin, the disappeared in Lebanon, and and stuff like that, which continues to this day.
Right.
And obviously the assassination of Luqman Slim last year, and so many other things that I'm barely scratching the surface with it.
Right. Yeah. Who said once that the political class today in Lebanon, they are the civil war lords, I think, warlords? The civil war lords, I think so. Someone said that, and
I've said that.
Listen, I mean, you said that. Yeah, you're right. You're right, Joey. I mean, like, look, he was like kicked out by the Syrian government, and he came back on a Syrian tank. Hezbollah came and was established early 80s, and look where they are now. Harakat Amal, and الحزب الديمقراطي الاشتراكي, all of them, they did not, like, the only party that has changed its leader, it was Yekelchyk, because of the murder of Bashir Jmail, and then I mean, but these people are even the same people, not even the same parties, right? The same people who were during the civil war are the people who are in power today in Lebanon, which is hilarious, ironic. Yeah, all of them, they should be in court.
Yeah, I mean, as we say in مضحك ببكي, what is funny is not funny. What is funny is sad. Whatever expression.
Right. It was funny, sad. Right.
Well,
right,
okay.
right,
I mean, obviously, I wanted to kind of emphasize one thing that I try and do is to always bring stories of people in these episodes. And so before we sort of kind of wrap up and finish with the book section, as I call it, or whatnot, we mentioned the complicity from a lot of pro-regime well, Palestinians in this specific case, but obviously none other groups of people as well. And the reason why they're so toxic is that obviously the regime does what it does, or often does what it does, while using Palestine as kind of its blanket, as kind of its, shield or whatever, rhetorically.
Right.
And yet, I think it's very important to mention the specific stories of people who are sort of on the wrong side, or like on both ends of both being victims of Israel and victims of the Assad regime.
Yeah, I mean, I keep putting and talking about this young man, Khalid Bakrawi, who is, if he is still alive, he would be now 35, maybe 34, 35. He was friend of my younger brother, and he was like my younger brother. So this guy used, if you remember the demonstrations for return demonstrations that took place in 2011, May and June. So Khalid went to June one on the 6th, on 5th of June, and he was shot by the Israelis because what happened that day, there was like no man's zone. The Israelis came from two sides. They entered actually the no man's zone, and they took positions, and they started shooting, and he was shot in his leg. I think the left one. I'm not sure. And this was in June 5th, 2011. And sometime in early 2012, I don't remember when exactly, Khaled, we were like working together for like humanitarian aid to Syria, and suddenly he disappeared. And we saw after like years later, when the photos, Caesar's photos were released, he was one of the people who were tortured to death. We saw his face in these photos. So yeah, this is one of, I know that a lot of you would hear a lot of stories like this. I mean, one of my uncles was shot by the Israelis during the invasion in 1982 in Beirut, and he was arrested by the Syrian government, and then he died later in heart attack. There are a lot of stories like this, Joey. I would say also, just to be fair, that there are a lot of people also. Maybe it's an exaggeration to say a lot, but it's good that there are some people in the Palestinian, at least the Palestinian side, that they recognize that what happened in Syria is the massacre and Bashar al-Assad is a dictatorship. And these are the people who we really need always to bring their voices, because these people have credibility. They are living under the Israeli occupation, or they are under the Israeli apartheid system in 1948 areas, and these people can, like, they really can represent more like the story of the Palestinian people everywhere, including our story as Palestinians in Syria. So I'm happy that there are some people still out there that they have the courage, because it needs courage actually. This kind of narrative would leave you sometimes with no friends at all. So it's not an easy situation for you to be in. This is why I use the word squeezed, right? Because it's squeezing, and it needs really a lot of work. Yeah, I mean, maybe we will not talk about like I would say this. I hesitate sometimes to talk about these sentimental issues, Joey. But you know, there is this whole generation that was born in mid 80s and 90s, and early 90s actually in Syria, especially in the refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps in Syria, because we had some privilege actually, to be honest with you, about having some civil society movements or organizations or forums that the Syrians did not have the privilege to enjoy it. And there was this generation of Khalid Bakrawi, who is the generation of citizenship and the human rights. And to be honest with you, Joey, this was the generation who taught our generation a lot of things. I've learned from Khalid and from Hassan, who's another actor and comedian who from Yarmouk camp also. He was arrested on checkpoint, and then we found his photo also. He was tortured to death by the Syrian government also from Caesar's photos. I mean, these two guys and other of their friends, I mean, they had kind of group, a forum, and they were 14 years old when they started this. And I remember the name, it was called Canaan Forum. I think it was in 2001 or 2002, actually. And it was all about like these young people, 14, 15 years old, they were discussing citizenship and social and cultural rights, and why and it's trying to understand or to understand Palestine from a human rights point of view. And this was the generation actually who really beared the burden of carrying the Syrian revolution. And this was the generation that mostly massacred by the Syrian regime at the beginning, the very beginning of the Syrian revolution, to an extent that the Syrian regime really exhausted any possibility for a leader to come out of this revolution, because the amount of killing was above and beyond what we can imagine. And part of this massacring was this category of young people who were born and raised specifically and after the second intifada in Palestine, because it had a huge impact on this generation, the Syrian and Palestinians. And this is what I call the human rights generation, that we learned a lot from, because the older generation, it was very disappointing, honestly. So Khalid Bakrawi is one of a lot of people who would have had bright future if they were still alive, but unfortunately, they're gone.
There's of course many stories like this one, and it's part of this podcast, like on a small enough scale, obviously, but it's to try and retell the stories as much as we can, and as much as I can through the story of someone like Khalid, point out these connections between the various, and my focus has been obviously Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, because of my own background. But yeah, I mean, thank you for this. The way I usually wrap up is I ask the guests to if there's anything that I haven't mentioned that you want to talk about, and then after that to recommend 3 books to listeners on any topic, and we end on that note.
Sure. First and foremost, thank you so much, Joey, for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. I mean, I have not done this in a very long time, and thank you for bringing me back to this field. And for books, actually, now I am in the mood of rereading things, you know. However, there is a book, because when the war in Ukraine started, I was like looking for something to understand Ukraine and their relationship with Russia and that history. So there is this book, Ukraine: What Everyone Needs to Know, by Serhy Yekelchyk. I'll send it to you. I don't know, like it's the name is very hard for me to to pronounce, but it's called Ukraine: What Everyone Needs to Know. It's a really nice book. It's a small book, small size, but it takes you from the current Ukraine, the Revolution of Dignity, back to the Orange Revolution, and then back to even like all the Soviet Union, and then to the older ages of that region, Eastern Europe. So this is like really a good book, and for people who would listen to this, I really encourage them to read these two books. Samir Kassir. This is really important. This is very important. This book, ديمقراطية سوريا واستقلال لبنان, it's really important. And this other book is called عسكر على these two books I know that they are like, these books are just articles that were collected together and put in books, and it focuses, both of them, they focus on details on the daily political life in Syria and Lebanon, but it is very important that if you could read them, you will have a good perspective about what was going on between Syria and Lebanon in the 90s and between 2000 and 2005 until he was assassinated. They are very important to be read, actually, for anyone who is interested in Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine.
Amazing. Thanks a lot, Nidal. I'm always happy when people recommend to read Samir Kassir. His books are not all translated, unfortunately, for non-Arabic speakers, but there's obviously mostly in Arabic. Some of them are in French, because he also wrote in French.
Right.
And quite a few of them have been translated in English, including his History of Beirut, which is an excellent book.
Right.
So all I have left to do is thank you for your time. This was really fantastic. I really thank like your efforts, and I'm sure none of this was easy to talk about, so I appreciate you doing so here.
Thank you so much, Joey. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.